Let's take a look at what you're doing this week. We're in Module 3. We're looking at metabolic pathways. You have your learning objectives here for the week and your weekly activity checklist. In your weekly learning materials, you have your short video lecture, your assigned readings. We have a link here to Khan Academy. You're also looking at Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 in the OpenStax textbook. There are some videos as well. This is fairly complicated material, and so the videos help you to visualize it a little bit better than just reading it. You have 3 videos here that will talk in general about metabolism and ATP, cellular respiration and the generation of ATP, and also photosynthesis. We also have some interactives. This allows you, again, to interact with the material a little bit more because it is fairly challenging to learn all this material and keep it straight in your head. And so these interactive challenges help you do that. There are also some links for science skills because you're going to be interpreting graphs in this assignment this week, and so this will help you to do that. In your first assignment here, you have a discussion, and in this discussion, you're going to be generating a worksheet that would be intended for use by high school students in learning about secondary metabolites. You will use an AI tool to help you create this classroom activity for the high school students, to explain to them and help teach them about secondary metabolites. Remember, secondary metabolites are these compounds that are typically produced by primarily plants and fungi, but we do see them in some insects where they are not using them for their own metabolism growth, energy production. They're used more for protection against other organisms. A lot of these are chemical compounds that are toxic to other organisms, or maybe just make it so that the plant material isn't very easily digested. Makes it so that a lot of herbivores don't end up eating them because they're just not very profitable to eat. There's a lot of these different kinds of secondary compounds that we find for defense mechanisms in organisms like plants and fungi. What you're going to be doing is creating a worksheet that teaches students about these secondary metabolites, but then also brings in some of that primary information they would need to understand what these secondary metabolites are all about. Read through the directions here, and then remember to view the rubric. In your initial post, you're going to use an AI tool to create a classroom worksheet. Make sure that you're using the AI tool, but then you're also modifying it. You want to make sure that you are checking it, because AI is not always correct. These are the items that you must include in that worksheet. We want to make sure that the students learn about these things. What is G3P? Where does it come from in the process of photosynthesis? What is the role of enzymes in these metabolic reactions? How does G3P get used to make other metabolites? If I take G3P and I modify it, I can make a secondary metabolic compound, and that's what they're looking at there. We want to look at cellular respiration and how eukaryotic cells use cellular respiration to release energy that is stored in chemical compounds. And then you're going to also have them diagram a known pathway for a secondary metabolite. How do I take one of those primary molecules that I see in photosynthesis and modify it to make a secondary compound? You want to make sure that this is something that's engaging the student. They're having to do something. You're also going to make sure that you double check anything that the AI gives you, because AI is not always factually correct. So it's up to you to make sure that what you're putting in there is correct. In your initial discussion post, you'll have 2 documents that you upload. One will be your worksheet. If you put it in as a shareable Google Doc, please make sure that you double check that it is shareable and that other students will be able to open. A lot of times when I get into Google Docs, then I find that I don't have the access and the permissions to open it. So make sure that you double check that. Another way that you can do it is to put it in as Microsoft Word. So either one of those will work. And then you're also going to have another document that lists what AI prompts did you use. So you're using AI prompts to help you with this worksheet. What did you type into the AI prompt when you were doing your worksheet? When you do your response to this, you're going to pick 2 students and you're going to do the worksheets that they have provided. You're going to be that high school student going through that worksheet. You'll fill out the worksheet and you'll post that, and you'll also give them some feedback about the worksheet, answering these questions about their activity. The next activity you'll do in week 3 is assignment 1, where you're looking at GMOs and photosynthesis. So you have some background here. What you're doing is looking at genetically modified organisms and trying to interpret some data from these GMOs. You're sort of role playing where you have a friend who is trying to grow crops. They have a farm and they've noticed some issues in productivity. And so you're trying to give them some information about GMOs so that they can decide whether or not GMOs might be a way to go to help the issue they're having with crop productivity. You will definitely want to make sure you go and read through all the materials, because if you're not familiar with the learning materials from this week and last week, the graphs that you're going to try to interpret will be very difficult for you to do. One of the first things you're going to do is look at some graphs that compare wild type organisms to genetically modified organisms, where genes have been inserted from other organisms that are hopefully there to help these plants do better. You'll see the non-GMO designated as wild type or non-transgenic. We have several graphs here, and you're going to interpret these graphs for this person in an email. It's telling you what the abiotic stress is. If I put a plant under fluctuating light, the question here might be, will a GMO plant do better under fluctuating light compared to a wild type plant? The data that we see down here is comparing that. We see here we're looking at steady state of light, and then we're also looking at fluctuating light. Underneath the figure, you'll see a brief description, and then if you want a more detailed description of it, they give you the link for the paper. The dark green bars here are the wild type plants. The GMO are the lighter ones. And you just have 2 different types of GMOs, inserting, say, different genes into the plant. The first one here is looking at CO2 assimilation. How quickly can it make sugars using CO2? This is looking at the efficiency of the photosystems. So remember, in our light reactions, we take photons of light and we create ATP. We're generating chemical energy from light energy. This is looking at the efficiency of that. Down here, we're looking at sort of the net efficiency, which is really looking at the difference between the top 2. We're looking at data from 2 different years. You're going to look at those data, and you're going to interpret them for your friend who is a farmer and decide whether or not you think that a GMO might be useful. In our second graph, instead of looking at light levels, we're looking at freezing temperatures specifically. We're using maize, and you can look at the actual article if you want a full description of what the graph is showing you rather than this abbreviated description of the graph. Here we're looking at electrolyte leakage. So this, as they describe down here, is looking at essentially damage to membranes. So if we have a lot of leakage, the membranes are bursting, which is what happens typically when a plant freezes. The crystals that form during the freezing process will rupture their cell membranes. Obviously not a good thing for photosynthesis, because now our thylakoid membranes are damaged and we can't run photosynthesis very effectively. This is looking at prior to freezing and then looking at the duration of the freeze. So this is without freezing and then duration of freeze. And then you're looking at the transgenic and non-transgenic organisms. And here we're just really looking at sort of 2 different sets of experiments that they ran. In the next one, we're looking at how the plant is going to respond to heat. We're looking at the wild type in the black dots. So this is the black dot line coming down here. And then all of these other ones here are various GMO organisms. And we're looking at the activation state of rubisco, which is a key enzyme for running photosynthesis. If the rubisco activation is low, photosynthesis is not happening as efficiently. As this goes down, we're getting less photosynthesis. Higher, we're getting more photosynthesis. You're going to interpret those graphs. You're also going to read a little bit about GMOs in general. So you want a little bit more information. We've got some data on GMOs, but you need to know a little bit more about sort of the general concept of GMOs. Here's a couple of links that will talk about GMOs and their use, pros and cons. You can also find your own information if you choose. After doing all of that, you're going to construct a professional email to your friend. And you're going to make sure that you include all of these items, if we come down here, you want to make sure that you tell them exactly what each of those graphs is showing. What is it showing? What are we measuring? What variables? And then how do we interpret that? And when we're saying how do we interpret that, we specifically really want to know, is the GMO doing better under these conditions or worse under these conditions? Because your friend wants to know whether they should start using GMOs in their crops or not. So if the GMO plant is doing worse, then no, they don't want to use that plant. If the GMO plant is doing better, has a higher rate of photosynthesis, a better efficiency, then yes, they might want to use a GMO. So you want to make sure that you interpret those graphs in that way. Make sure that you cover all of these items here. Your next assignment this week, you're going to look at the journey of carbon. If we were to watch, let's say, a plant performing photosynthesis, where did the carbon first start off? Well, it was out in the atmosphere, right? We have atmospheric CO2 floating around. The plant's taking in that CO2. Where is it going? So we're going to follow that carbon that's attached to the CO2 through this cycle. And we're going to create a storybook for elementary school age children that will allow them to kind of see what is happening to the carbon. Where is it going? We want to allow them to see that and to visualize that. I'm going to use Microsoft Sway. There's a link to it here. So you'll have to log in probably with your Unity email to get access to Microsoft Sway. Once you get in there, they will have where you can just create your own thing, or you can use a template. Templates are sometimes easier to start off with if you've never used Microsoft Sway before. We're going to go create sort of this storybook. Make sure you take a look at the different things that need to be in the storybook. This is looking at information that you're going to need to go back and look at, is some of the information from chapters 4 and 5 about cellular respiration and photosynthesis. When you write your story, again, you can use AI to help you write the story, but as usual, you want to fact check. You want to make sure that you are creating it yourself using information from AI. Sort of like if you're writing a paper, you're using information from other sources. You're not just putting in exactly what those authors said. You're using it, but you're not just saying whatever I get from AI, I'm just going to plunk right there into Sway. You're going to look at it, make sure it's correct, modify it, and then put it into this storybook. There's a few things that you want to make sure that you put in here. You want to make sure that you feature these molecules. You also feature the organelles. You're going to highlight 2 enzymes that are important to these pathways. You're going to describe ATP and why it's important. And then you're also going to reflect on the importance of plants to ecosystems, primarily trying to justify conservation of plants. Why do we need plants? You are also going to support your reflection here with some evidence from a peer-reviewed journal article. Make sure you go into a scientific journal and get an article. It can be either a review article or a research article, but it does need to be peer-reviewed. So it's a journal, it's not just a website. Once you have all that together, you're going to create the storybook. In the storybook, you're going to want to include images and diagrams in addition to some explanation verbiage. It's telling you some of the minimum requirements that you have for these. You want to make sure you put in the equations for photosynthesis and cellular respiration. You use 2 diagrams from each of the 2 chapters that we looked at, and then you can also use other images if you like. And make sure that you cite your sources, and the storybook should be at least 8 pages. And then down below, of course, we also have the grading rubric, which reflects all of those instructions. So that covers all of your assignments for week 3. You have the discussion and then the 2 regular assignments. If you have any questions throughout the week, please feel free to reach out. I can either address your questions in an email or we can arrange to meet virtually. I hope you have a great week.